The topic I'm going to talk about today, I'm titling it Ignorance, a Long Game. So I'm kind of following on to what I talked about yesterday, and I'm going to repeat the line that I ended with ended the article that Nelly and I had written, which will come out in a campaign monitor. You guys will get that if you're on our mailing lists. So I ended the article with, actually, we don't know. So much is uncertain and out of our control. This basic Buddhist teaching is right in our face now. We don't know. I don't know. I really have thought about how many times it is very vulnerable to say, I don't know. We don't know. How many times it's come from a position of strength or, really seeing it like an understanding that we don't know. So I want to consider this in the long game view on the subject of ignorance being we don't know. And I'm listening to a book called Sapiens, and I think I've mentioned it a few times, by Yuval Noah Harari. And while it's called A Brief History of Humankind, it's taking me a really long time to get through it. And I'm listening to it, and I keep having to return it at the library so that the next person can listen to it, and that takes them a long time, and then I'm going to get it back. But in this book, he asserts that it's only been in recent history that we humans have acknowledged the strength of saying we don't know. It's only been what he calls a scientific revolution 500 years ago, is he said that we've come together and said there's value that in knowing that we don't know, in the ignorance that's around us. And this era has followed an era of certainty, of religious beliefs, of philosophical beliefs. And in my mind, it points to the very long history we have of reflexively, I'm going to stop just 1 second because there's a screen share going on. I'm just going to pause and see if I can, there we go. Okay, now I won't be distracted. Let me think for a minute where I was. We have a long history of reflexively hiding what we don't know and stating what we think we know with great certainty. And that was a long era of human history. And so we're just in this youthful, young era of elevating not knowing and really taking it in to follow that and give it some value. So these characteristics of the scientific revolution, as Harari quotes, are acknowledging that we learn through awareness, through observation, and through experimentation. And that everything we learn is provisional because we're going to know more later. We're going to know more at a different point in time. And to me, this sounds like a backdrop of reflective meditation. We fit right into this scientific revolution, although I wouldn't have qualified or quantified our practice as scientific. But there it is, being built in the middle of science that's really acknowledging we don't know before we start looking at something, and we're going to learn more from looking at it more deeply. But in the book, Harari doesn't actually acknowledge that the Buddhist tradition in the way that I understand it. He puts it as part of the religious certainty era. And 2,500 years ago, roughly, when Buddhism started, it has the word ignorance or not knowing laced throughout the teachings. It's something that they were already onto, and that they were trying to look at how to wear it away, and that it was a force to be reckoned with. And I had to think, and of course, this is what happens when you start reading books that kind of plant new suggestions or new ideas. You start to look at your old ways you've learned about something. And I learned about ignorance. One way I learned about it is through the teaching of rebirth in Buddhism. And that was when I first came into practice, and of teaching of which I'm agnostic now. But at that point, and now I find it fascinating in the way this was talked about in the teachings, because what gets reborn in the teaching of rebirth is ignorance, not a self, not a person, not your soul. What gets reborn is ignorance and patterns. Patterns or proclivities or habits. And we call those sankharas in Buddhist terminology. And so I find it really interesting to think about how often the Buddha talked about his past lives within the suttas, within the texts, and he had many, many, many of them, and he had many details about them. And he and the community talked about it as frequently and as easily as we talk about our early childhood, as we talk about our growing up and the periods of development that we have in one human life. And so they talked about, rebirth differently than we or I will talk about it today. So I'm going to continue in this sense of saying I'm using it as a metaphor, and a metaphor of knowing what a long game it is to wear away ignorance. At that time, he was talking about how many lifetimes it takes, how long ignorance stays around in the many forms that it comes in, and the way that we're dealing with it. Even a later philosopher, I can't remember the years of Nagarjuna, who's another Indian philosopher, he talked about ignorance is always a part of conditionality, that even while we think we know something, we're going to know that we don't know other things, and we can't know everything at one point in time about anything. So since ignorance will be our companion, I thought it's better to be a little bit more curious about it. And I have two kind of ideas around it this morning that I'm going to just end with. One is that there is a kind of ignorance that I would look at as more innocent or blameless, and that we're learning things. We're in this process of where we don't know, that we have a kind of humility and we want to know more. And I see this a lot in like family dynamics or inherited things that come down from others, from cultures, from families. But there's a way that we can not have to blame or shame ourselves or others around this kind of ignorance, that it is developmental and that we're all at different developmental stages around what we know or don't know. But the other kind of ignorance that I've been seeing lately, and I see it a lot in kind of in the larger political realm, and I actually found a word for it in sociology. It's called agnotology. I don't think I'll ever say it again, but I'm going to say it here because it's just always interesting to find what you're thinking and then you find a definition for it. But it's the study of deliberate, culturally induced ignorance or doubt. Like you're trying to sell your influence or sell an opinion or a product or win favor in a misleading way. Misleading scientific data, and it creates a lot of misinformation. And it's also a way to overwhelm, is that you deliberately adding a lot of facts into something so that you actually are kind of confusing people and not able to know which facts are real and which facts have the more a priority and weight. And that it creates greater uncertainty, which is a different kind of uncertainty than I think that we're trying to actually cultivate within a Buddhist practice. Now, these are just distinctions from my mind. These are not real. These are just the way I'm thinking about it this morning. But I also found a very nice quote, which I'm going to end with, and I don't know who this came from. It's one of those things that's floating around, but it actually makes the point that I'm trying to talk about around becoming more aware of ignorance. Ignorance can have negative effects on individuals and societies, but can also benefit them by creating within them the desire to know more. For example, ignorance within science, and I'm going to put ignorance within meditation practice, within ourselves, within our communities, opens the opportunity to seek knowledge and make discoveries by asking new questions. And this can take place especially if individuals possess curious minds. Okay, I'm going to end here.